May is Older Americans Month, and we have lots to offer. Check out our calendar on QPL's website for upcoming older adult programs, including Zumba, creative aging workshops, book discussions, and more. Our mail-a-book service also offers homebound customers the convenience of having library materials delivered to their door free of charge. For more information, visit queenslib.org/MAB22. Get access to free, unlimited internet at home with the Queens Connected Mobile Hotspot Lending Program. Wi-Fi hotspots are available for you to borrow from several Queens Public Library locations. For eligibility requirements and participating library locations, visit queenslib.org/hotspot22. Our website calendar is the perfect tool to find activities for all ages, adults, teens, and children. You can find programs at your local library or online. Visit the QPL calendar at queenslibrary.org. Looking for things to do at Queens Public Library? We've compiled 125 of them. Pick up a booklet at your nearest library location or view the list online at queenslib.org/things to do. Share your journey with us on social media using the hashtag QPL125, and you will be automatically entered into a drawing for a free Queens Public Library tote bag.
Welcome to Queens Public Library's talk with Bob Spitz, author of Led Zeppelin, the biography. The Washington Post wrote, Spitz, who has written well-regarded biographies of the Beatles and Julia Child, delivers a 600-page tome that collects every reliable story previously reported and is bolstered by original reporting and interviews, all delivered in brisk and straightforward prose. The book is peppered with musical references that Spitz describes as evocatively as mere writing can describe music. People magazine wrote, in his authoritative, unsparing history of the biggest rock group of the 1970s, Spitz delivers inside details and analysis with his well-known gift for storytelling. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Brian Alessandro. I have written for Interview Magazine, Newsday, Penk, Huffington Post, and have recently adapted Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story into a graphic novel for Top Shelf Productions' Penguin Random House, which will be released this fall. Additionally, I co-edited an anthology of essays and interviews about William S. Burroughs, which we published this summer. I am the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the literary journal, The New Engagement. My first novel, The Unmentionable Mon, was published in 2015 by Cairn Press, and my first feature film, Afghan Hound, was produced by Marriott Media in 2011 and is now streaming on Plex TV. Culture Connection, curated by Daniel Zaleski and now in its 9th year at the Queens Public Library, is proud to present international artists from emerging talent to award-winning masters. These disciplines include music, theater, author talks, and film. Now expanding into a virtual format, Culture Connection is currently reaching a global audience. Bob Spitz is the author of The Beatles, the biography, Reagan, An American Journey, Deary, The Remarkable Life of Julia Child, as well as books about the Woodstock Festival and Bob Dylan. He has also written for the New York Times Magazine, GQ, Condé Nast Traveler, Men's Journal, InStyle, Esquire, and The Washington Post. Led Zeppelin, for those of you who are somehow unaware, was an English rock band formed in 1968 and comprised of vocalist Robert Plant, guitarist Jimmy Page, bassist keyboardist John Paul Jones, and drummer John Bonham. Their original name was the New Yardbirds. Their music drew heavily from African-American blues and English folk music, but they ushered in an era of album-oriented rock and stadium rock. They are among the best-selling musicians of all time, selling 300 million albums. All members of the band are still alive, except for John Bonham, of course, who died at the age of 32 in 1980. Bob, hello. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Ryan, it's great to be here. It'll be fun.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the surviving members of Led Zeppelin are known to be guarded, and previous biographies, let's say, fairly focused on more sensationalistic and controversial aspects of their career.
Yeah.
Though you had extensive access to them in their work, and your treatment is really, I have to say, comprehensive and humane. Please tell us a little bit about how you were able to produce such a thorough and intimate story about such historically impenetrable artists, and how involved were the band members?
Yeah. Well, the band members, I'll tell you, weren't involved at all, surprisingly.
Okay.
I was told that I would have complete access to them.
Mhm.
They knew my work. They knew that I was a musician. I had managed and played with Bruce Springsteen. I managed Elton John. That sat well with them. But this book went into research about 2 months right before the Me Too instance broke.
Yes.
And once that happened, I was told that none of those guys would speak.
Oh
And
my gosh.
so
Wow.
I understood it. I mean, there
Sure,
were,
of course. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So that gave me, it made the job much more difficult. But I was sitting at home bemoaning this.
Mhm.
And my wife said to me, "What are you reading?" And I said, "I'm reading David McCulloch's Life of John Adams."
Mhm.
And she looked at me and she said, "Did he interview John Adams?"
That's great.
I said, John Adams has been dead for 250 years. She looked at me and she said, "Get to work."
Mhm.
And
That's
so
great.
it really changed my whole perspective. And I decided that if I was going to tell the story of Led Zeppelin, I would have to do all the legwork around them,
Mhm.
and really be on the top of my game as a musician to convey to you, the reader, exactly what you needed to know that they were doing when they rehearsed, when they played, when they made recordings, so that I could convey that to the reader and really explain it to them with my knowledge.
And what's great is, as you said, you were a musician, so you, of course, have an understanding and an understanding of and an insight into the artistry. But you're also a journalist, so you know how to do rigorous research.
Yeah, it really, I decided that the first thing that I would do would be to find everybody who had ever worked with him who was still alive. That's always a problem.
Yeah.
And they all came to the fight. They really did. I was blessed in that regard, and anyone who worked with them really came to explain to me how they played, how they lived, how they loved, and made their music. I was lucky.
What was your process, and also how long did it take you to complete the book?
Well, the process is always the same. I start with the outer rings of the research first, the people who were least essential, and worked my way into the people who were the most essential. So that by the time I got to the people who could really tell you what the nuts and the bolts were, I had enough experience and enough knowledge to ask them the insightful questions. I researched the book for about 2 years, and then usually it takes me about 2 years to write. But during COVID, I had none of the usual distractions, and I sat down and I wrote the book very quickly.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the name for a minute, Led Zeppelin. You muse on it a bit in the prologue. What was the origin of the name, especially in relation to Keith Moon?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Back when Jimmy played with the Yardbirds with Jeff Beck, they did a session in which they were just fooling around for some stuff for a Jeff Beck album. They got together in the studio and they played 4 or 5 different numbers, and it was Jimmy and Jeff Beck and Keith Moon and John Entwistle. And I forget who the drummer was in the session. I'm just forgetting for a second. But at the end of it, there was talk of maybe Keith and Entwistle leaving the Who, teaming up with Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. And Keith Moon said, "Yeah, that would go down like a Led Zeppelin."
Yeah.
Jimmy put that in the back of his mind. And it took almost 3 years later, when they were looking for a name for the band, for Jimmy to pull that out of his mind and say, "I got the name for the band." And of course they changed the spelling of lead.
Right.
To give it, first of all, Peter Grant, their manager, thought people would pronounce it Lead Zeppelin. They would mispronounce it. But also, it gave it a bit of an edge. Led Zeppelin. Who spells anything L-E-D?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's great. I love it. And what a great story. And you really, I love that you started with that in the prologue. What role did the blues play in Jimmy Page's formation and in the band's creation particularly?
Well, the blues played an immense role. It's really interesting that in the early 60s in the UK, an electric blues phenomenon just developed. We did not have that here in the States. So people like Jimmy and Keith Richards and Mick Jagger and Eric Clapton fell in love with the real blues enthusiasts from the United States. Big Bill Broonzy, John Lee Hooker, Sonny and Terry, Bucko White, all the great, really, Sonny Boy Williamson, and they became almost gods to the young kids who were post-war babies in the UK. We missed it here. The blues just went right by our heads.
That's interesting.
But once the blues took hold in the UK, all those great artists went over to London, toured the UK, were embraced by all these young kids, and they developed a new sound. And the sound was to take from all these great Black artists, and Chuck Berry, of course, and to jack it, to put an electric sound to it and create rock and roll around it. John Mayall did it. The Blues Incorporated did it. Eric Clapton did it with a number of bands he played with. And of course, he was the lead guitarist for the Yardbirds, which played electric blues. And Led Zeppelin did it as well. Their first album and their second album had real R&B roots, but R&B, not like the Four Tops and the Supremes, but all these great urban blues and Delta blues artists. And they borrowed from it and they improved on it and they put a new beat to it and gave us a complete new music.
Something very new and groundbreaking, really, in 1968. This was a new sound, a fusion, if you will. It all began with Page and the Yardbirds, right? So how did the band get together? What was the evolution from the Yardbirds to the new Yardbirds to Led Zeppelin? Can you walk us through that?
Well, yeah, sure. The Yardbirds were a great band. They had a couple hits, some top 40 hits. They had a great guitarist named Eric Clapton. And when Eric Clapton left, they had another guitarist named Jeff Beck.
We're doing all right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll tell you this, I'll just segue away for a second. But Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page as teenagers lived a mile apart from each other.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's right. It's you mentioned that. That's
they lived in around Epsom, near London, in the suburbs of London. And you have to say to yourself, something must have been in the water. But these guys, as teenagers, as 17 and 18-year-olds, would gather in Jimmy's living room every Sunday, and they'd play. They'd talk about rock and roll. They'd trade music with each other. They'd show each other riffs. This was before they were really even playing with bands. Right. And so it happened right there, which was really incredible. Getting back to the Yardbirds, Eric Clapton left the Yardbirds because he felt that they weren't being authentic to the blues anymore. And so Jeff Beck filled in. And one night, and this is documented in the book, they were playing at an Oxford ball at the university, and the band was coming apart. Several of the members decided this wasn't for them. They got very drunk. And on stage that night, they literally fell down. Keith Relf, who was the lead singer, blue raspberries in the microphone all night. Jeff Beck had taken Jimmy Page with him to sit in the audience and to see this. And Jimmy thought this was the greatest thing he had ever seen. He thought it was anarchic. And of course, it was in a way.
Yeah.
And he told Jeff afterwards, look, the band's coming apart, but you and I could really do wonders with this band.
Wow.
Let's take it and reform it and see where it goes. And so the next incarnation of the Yardbirds had, a lot of the same members. It had, Jim McCarty on drums, and Keith Rolfe was gone, but Jeff and Jimmy played dueling guitars. And that worked for a very short while.
Right.
And then it didn't work because Jeff Beck, and I will tell you this, I'm prejudiced. I think Jeff Beck is the greatest guitar player I have ever seen. But he is also the number one head case in the world.
In the world.
And they couldn't perform together. And so Jeff naturally walked off the tour in the middle of the tour, left Jimmy to go from bass to lead guitar. And there was the seeds of Led Zeppelin.
That was it. Yeah.
He saw it, he heard it, and he just bided his time until he could transform this into a new band. And it became the new Yardbirds and then Led Zeppelin.
He was a real visionary.
He was.
He really was like a visionary because he was also obsessed with trying to find the right voice. Right? I remember you writing about his obsession with finding the right voice, the right sound. It involved initially Stevie Winwood, and then eventually it led him to Robert Plant.
But even before that, Jimmy had a sound in his head, and it was a sound of music unlike anything we had heard before. Yeah. It was harder, it was more aggressive. It turned music inside out. The riffs that really bound the middle of songs now took them and shot them into the stratosphere. And that was going through Jimmy's head. And we had never heard music like that before. But I deviated from your question. I'm sorry, Brian.
I'm glad you spoke to that because it's integral to his character and to his vision and to what the band would become. But can you speak a moment about his fixation on finding the right voice, the right vocalist?
Exactly. Well, I actually talked to the one voice that he really wanted. He wanted a guy. First of all, he wanted Stevie Winwood,
right?
Who was the lead singer and the organist for the Spencer Davis group, and Stevie wasn't going anywhere at the time. But then he was really interested in a guy named Terry Reid. We don't know Terry over here, but Terry Reid in the UK. At the age of 16, was playing concerts all through the UK, and he eventually opened for the Rolling Stones here in the States, and had a few really good albums. He was a blues singer. He had a really rough, gravelly voice like Stevie Winwood's, and Jimmy thought Terry Reid's the guy to do this. But Terry had just signed a contract to make a record with a producer named Mickey Most. Mickey Most was a big pop. He had produced the Yardbirds. He had produced Lulu, Tom Jones, many hits, but it had a real top 40 sound to him. And he was also Peter Grant's partner. Peter Grant became, of course, the manager of Led Zeppelin. And Terry didn't want to give up the opportunity of making a solo album. So he said no to Jimmy, something Terry told me he's regretted for the last 45 years.
I'm sure.
Yeah. And he had a beautiful voice. It would have taken Led Zeppelin even to a little harder. It would have given them a little harder edge.
Interesting.
But Terry said, you ought to talk to a guy named Robert Plant. I saw him play. In fact, Plant had opened a show. His band, a local band, had opened a show for Terry. And Terry thought that he might be pretty interesting. They couldn't find Robert anywhere. Robert and John Bonham they were off the grid. They were in the Midlands, had no phones at their homes, were just playing with local bands. And so Jimmy tracked Robert down, saw him perform at a teacher's college, in which there were only like 20 people in the audience, none of them paying attention to the band. But Jimmy practically fell off his chair when he heard Robert sing. And he thought, this guy's got to be a bigger head case than Jeff Beck, because why wouldn't somebody with a voice like that be in a great rock and roll band?
Yeah.
And as it turned out, he saw the future right there. Robert was the guy. And Robert, of course, said to Jimmy, I have a friend who's a drummer. You ought to check him out.
And it was Bonham.
Of course it was Bonham. Yeah, they were both friends.
They've had, as you spoke before at the top of the interview, they've had quite a few influences, especially the black jazz and blues musicians that came from the United States.
Yeah.
Who are some of their other influences? And also speak to, I think it's fair to say, how good they are about giving credit to certain artists as mentors.
Oh, we're going to go this way and that way on that.
Okay.
Robert in those days was doing Jimmy Reed songs and Chuck Berry songs, but he also was in love with the San Francisco sound. And in those days, that meant Moby Grape, Jefferson Airplane, Love, a band from LA that were very big at the time. And so he was performing what he called hippie music as well as really roots R&B. And Robert was really listening to roots R&B from the time he was 12 years old. I mean, we have to remember that this music was deep inside of these guys from a very, very early age. And so when Jimmy heard Robert, he had this amalgam of music that he was doing. And Jimmy knew that he could mold this guy in many different directions. And if you listen to their first album, they'll do things like Dazed and Confused. But at the same time, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, a Joan Baez song, a traditional song that Joan Baez did.
Right.
And so, I'm sure if you've seen any interviews that I've done, you'll know that I didn't know any Led Zeppelin music when I started this. I had been on the road with Bruce Springsteen when they were popular, and I missed them completely. Oh. And so when I went back and listened to their roots, which is what began this question, I heard them, I heard in their music, not what I thought, which was heavy metal, headbanging music. I heard Jimmy Reed influences. I heard Dazed and Confused. I heard You Shook Me. I heard Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. And it spoke to me in a way that encompassed everything that had been part of my life as a musician and as a writer of music. And so I was kind of blown away by Led Zeppelin. And really went back and looked at how Jimmy and Robert and Bonzo and Jonesy brought all of their influences to this new sound that I had dismissed early on. Really.
You said something that really struck me. You said that it was that the type of music, the blues, the jazz from America by Black musicians was something that was really deeply ingrained within them from a very young age. It's extremely important, I think, to look at that because it shows how organic it was. It wasn't like they were just co-opting and borrowing because it's what was sort of cool or trendy. They had a real pure love from a very young age.
They were real listeners. I mean, they listened to everything they could get their hands on. And I have to tell you, back post-war in the UK, they could not get their hands on much. I know that I talked to the lead guitarist who was in Robert's high school band. And he told me Robert would go, as a 14-year-old to the record store, look to see how he could order these albums from the United States of the great blues singers. And he would order them and he would wait a month, maybe 2 months until they arrived. And when those records arrived, he studied them the way I studied organic chemistry as a pre-med student, and then once he was done with that, he would pass it around to everybody he knew because if he was going to play with these guys, the young kids who were his age, who were just emerging as musicians, then he wanted them to be as up on this music as he was. And as you posed this question, Brian, this was deep inside of these guys. I mean, from the age of 12, 14, 15, they were listening, they were growing, they were really learning about music in ways. I don't know if we had that same experience.
Tell us a little bit about January 1969 and the Boston Tea Party performance and why that was so significant for the band.
Yeah, it opens the book, of course.
Yeah.
It's the preface of the book. They had been, the Led Zeppelin had been together for about a month. They were having no success in the UK. They couldn't get bookings at all. No one wanted to see them. Well, very hard for a new band. You know, there was no radio really to speak of aside from the BBC. And so if you didn't have a hit record on the BBC, nobody knew who you were.
Sure.
But Peter Grant, their manager, knew that if they came to the United States, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of radio stations, and FM was just emerging as a new way for people to hear new music.
Sure.
So if you were in Boston playing at the place they played at, the Tea Party, and they started playing your record on the radio on BCN, WBCN in Boston, on, say, Thursday, by Friday, there would be lines around the block waiting to see what these groups were like, because they would play the death out of these records and introduce them to the listening public. So it was very important for Peter Grant to get the band to the United States. He knew they wouldn't break in the UK. He would break them here, and he brought them. And Boston was very key. They had been out west. They got a tepid response. And he said, if we can break you in the East, if we can break you at the Tea Party in Boston, and then they were going to New York to play the Fillmore afterwards, then this band would make it. And so they had 3 nights in Boston. And the first night, there were lines around the block. They played well. Second night, Saturday night, they did well. Sunday night, you couldn't get another person in that place. There was, it held 500 people. There were 850 people in that Tea Party. The place was rocking. Zepp turned the amps from 10 up to 14. I mean, you know, the one thing about that band is you didn't just hear them, you felt them as well. And so they came out and they played their set. They played about 8 or 10 songs. They got such a response that they went backstage, and Don Law, who ran the Tea Party, said, you got to go back. And they said, well, you know, we can't go back. We did our set. He said, you got to go back. They're going to tear this place down.
Oh my gosh.
And so they went back on stage, and they did something I'd never heard before. They played the same set again, the same songs.
Wow.
And at the end of it, the response was even greater. And Law said, look, you got to go back. I mean, you got to go back. And these guys looked at each other and said, we did the same set twice. We can't go back. They went out and they played anything they knew. They played Beatles songs. They played Berry songs. They played Yardbird songs. They had a blast. And at the end of the night, that place went berserk. And the reverberations went out on FM radio. And Led Zeppelin, I felt, was made that night.
Wow.
And Peter Grant hugged those guys afterwards. Peter was a very big man.
Right.
He was about 350 pounds. He picked all of them up in one bear hug and said, this is it. And so I opened that book the same way I opened up the Beatles book. And the Beatles book opens up in a place that was called Litherland Town Hall. They had been away from Liverpool for 2 years, playing in Hamburg. They left Liverpool as the worst band in Liverpool, and they came back as the best band in Liverpool. And that show made them that night. And I felt the same thing happened with Led Zeppelin. And this was the way to open up this book.
Can that happen anymore, Bob? Does that happen anymore with musicians? One night, one performance, and suddenly history is made?
I think it's tough because in the old days, you really had to go out there and work.
Mm-hmm.
Today you can do a video, and if you're kind of intriguing, if you look nice, if you wear great costumes, if you have good co-stars in your video, it can go viral. But those guys really had to go out and sell themselves. They had to sell the music that they were playing.
Grassroots, really.
You bet. I mean, we did it with Bruce Springsteen. With Bruce, we were on the road for when the first album came out, a year and a half, and we would play a show in Boston one night, drive to Chicago the next night, drive back to North Carolina the night after that. I mean, we worked hard, but it was getting out in front of somebody and convincing them and showing them what you do and exciting them. I don't know if you can excite somebody in the same way anymore because it's come down to image rather than craft.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I'd like to, if you would indulge me, I want to read just one paragraph from your book to give our viewers a sample of your language.
Read a book.
I think every paragraph in your book is good. I'm going to read about your meditation on Whole Lotta Love.
Sure.
Whole Lotta Love established a new, exciting standard in rock and roll. It was loud, delirious, uncontainable, oozing overheated masculinity with the kind of unforgettable riff that resonated for the ages. It sounded like all the elements of rock and roll distilled to the core of its explosive essence. It not only confirmed Led Zeppelin as a musical force, it signaled they were the torchbearers of heavy metal, whether Jimmy was inclined to wear the badge or not. So that was powerful, and I just wanted to share that. Where did John Bonham's nickname Bonzo come from? That's not.
I think his parents.
Okay.
When he was born, his parents said, "Oh, it's Bonzo." But John was Bonzo from the time he was 12 or 13 years old. He would. People told me who played with him in bands that in the UK they had noise. There were noise restrictions. And a lot of the pubs where bands broke in the Midlands, where Bonzo and Robert were from, played in pubs that had it like a stoplight set up. And if the band was at a decent decibel rating, then the stoplight was green. If the band was, a little louder, it was yellow. And if they went into red, they pulled the plug. Well, every time Bonzo played, he couldn't keep a band because every time they rehearsed, just to set up, Bonzo would go into the red.
Wow.
And they would say, "Your band can't play here tonight," and they would be jettisoned from a pub and lose the date. And so he got the name Bonzo very early because it defined this guy. He drank to excess, he played to excess. He lived to excess. He was Bonzo.
Yeah. After 12 years and 8 albums, Robert Plant, it said, mostly wrote the lyrics, Jimmy mostly the music. But was that always the case? What was the band's creative process? If you can.
At the beginning, at the beginning it was awkward. Jimmy was the professional. And Robert felt as though he was a real amateur. He was enamored of Jimmy. He didn't put himself forward. He felt on the first album, maybe album and a half, that he didn't give his all. And then all of a sudden, he found his voice. He found his voice as not just as a singer, but as a writer. And he felt that he was contributing as much to the band as Jimmy was. And that, of course, starts their ego problems, which we can get into a little later. Sure. And I need to tell you about to draw this full circle. Sure. But Robert would write to Jimmy's whatever Jimmy brought to a session. Jimmy would come into each session with riffs. And this is really an interesting point about Led Zeppelin. And I think one of the things that makes me feel as if they never really lived up to their full potential, and that is that Jimmy didn't write songs. He didn't write melodies. Jimmy wrote riffs. And he crocheted them together to make them fit. And if you listen to, I mean, we can take Stairway to Heaven is the best example of that. There are about 4 different rhythm changes in it, mood changes. And it's not because he constructed it that way. It's because he came with all these riffs and he didn't know what to do with them. And he smushed them all together.
That's great.
And so Robert had to write to that. And Robert found that he was good at it.
Yeah.
He wrote Stairway to Heaven in one sitting. He couldn't control himself. I mean, that took a lot to do because there were so many rhythm changes, so many different ways to approach that material. And so that was their process. Jimmy would come to each, whenever he said that we're going to record, and it was Jimmy's band. Jimmy determined everything. He would say, we're going to rehearse. We've got this house. We're all going to go live in the house. I'll bring the material. And he did. And he would perform the riffs and expect Robert to somehow find a way to couple them together and to pull a song out of it. And God knows Robert knew how to do it. I mean, he figured out how to do it.
A very happy, synergistic marriage, really.
It was. And everything arose out of the rehearsals.
Yeah.
He didn't come with songs. He came with riffs. He expected everybody to pitch in. Jonesy pitched in. Bonzo in many ways pitched in. And those sessions were very organic. And that's the way Led Zeppelin produced their albums.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the band's compilation of unused track album, Coda, which was released in 1982 after their breakup? You dedicated an entire chapter to it beautifully. And in music also, what does the term Coda mean?
Well, Coda always means, it's the end of something.
Right.
And of course, this was definitely the end. They were never going to call this album anything but Coda. And they really went through the archives to find things that were in decent enough shape that they could pull together, because Bonzo was already gone. He had died before the album came out.
Yeah.
It was not going to be an album of their bits and pieces. It was going to be Jimmy had other songs ready to roll, and he, more than anything, he had told Bonzo right before Bonzo died, we're going to go in, we're going to make a new album, but we're going back to rock and roll. It's going to be like Whole Lotta Love. It's going to be like rock and roll and Kashmir, Little Interesting Things. But we're going to pull out all the stops. And Bonzo was up for it. So when it came time to do Coda, they just had to look at things that they had taken off other albums, weren't ready to use, and to see if they could find a compilation that worked. I think they did. It's not their finest album. We all know that.
Sure.
But it kind of, I think it kind of puts a period at the end of Led Zeppelin.
It does. It does do that.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a bit about the recent end to the Stairway to Heaven plagiarism case that began in 2014?
Yeah. Listen, I think I'm the only guy in the United States who feels that it doesn't sound like Spirit's song. It's not like George Harrison co-opting One Fine Day. There are a lot of incriminations, however. Led Zeppelin did play with Spirit at their very first date in the United States, in Denver. They heard Spirit do that song that was in the back of their mind. I'm sure that they were influenced, but being influenced, I think, is not enough to say you stole somebody else's song.
Sure.
And I feel like they added enough to Stairway to Heaven to make it original and theirs, unlike, say, Whole Lotta Love.
And the judgment that was handed down 2 years ago, was it now or so? It
Yeah.
exonerated them.
It exonerated Led Zeppelin by the skin of their teeth. And most people that I know feel that I'm wrong, that they feel that Led Zeppelin lifted that song, note for note. I'm not their apologist, but as a musician, I feel like they added enough to, we all borrow. And
Sure.
In fact, I'm borrowing from you tonight. You'll see it in my next book, Brian.
Oh, I can't wait. Thank you. It'll be my honor. Though they were commercially successful, they were not necessarily critically successful early on during
They
their
were
tenure.
not.
Critics were not so appreciative of their artistry during this 12-year period. Why do you think they were not recognized critically during their active years? Later, critics then said, oh, we might have missed something. They were great. Why didn't they get it in real time?
A couple reasons. There was a changing of the generations. A lot of the established critics of the day when Led Zeppelin broke were guys who had grown up, and I use the term guys liberally because they were mostly white,
right,
college-educated guys
Sure.
who had grown up with Elvis, but then graduated to Crosby, Stills and Nash, Joni Mitchell, James Taylor. And they heard this new sound and they felt that this was for kids. They didn't understand the new generation and they didn't open their minds to it. And they had a fraternity among those critics. And, we know their names, Greil Marcus and Robert Palmer and really good writers, but they didn't want to kowtow to they didn't want to acknowledge a new generation sound. They were invested in, John Landau is another guy, Bruce's manager now, but he was a really well-known rock and roll critic. All of them panned Led Zeppelin. So that's one instance. But the other instance in why they weren't critically well received was Led Zeppelin's fault. And that is they distrusted the press and they decided from the very beginning they weren't going to cooperate with them whatsoever. And they treated the press badly. In fact, they were arrogant toward the press, sometimes violent toward the press. And if in fact they had a press party for one of their new albums, all the guys from Led Zeppelin would sit at a table cordoned off from everybody who was at the press party, and they wouldn't talk to them. And that was their arrogance. And I think that arrogance really, really hurt them. They decided that we're going to treat the press badly. And so they got treated badly as well. And the irony is Robert and Jimmy wanted nothing more than to have good press. They read every single article that was written about them. After every show in their hotel room, they would get all the newspapers, all the press pieces, and read them. And they would be upset that, they weren't embraced, but they didn't go that extra mile, and they needed to do that.
In 1980, when Bonham died, he was only 32 years old. It is an unfortunate stereotype, the self-destructive musician star who dies young. We have Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, Cobain, Winehouse, Tupac, Buckley, to name a few, who died very young. What responsibility do you think the music industry, promoters, record labels, talent agents have in protecting young, impressionable musicians?
And let's extend that to sports figures as well.
Yeah.
Here's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who hit the spotlight in a not just national, but international spotlight at the age of 18, 19, 20. And with that comes money and acclaim and a bubble of unreality. And so who's responsible to tell these guys, let's try to figure out where you fit into all this, and let's try to keep a good head through all this. If you're lucky and you have a good manager, and I've been in that situation. I've seen it happen with a lot of managers. They sit down, they talk to the artist, and they say, look, we're going to invest your money. We're going to keep reality in front of you at all times. Peter Grant never did that with Led Zeppelin. Not only did Peter Grant try to boost the craziness that was going on around them, but he made sure that cocaine and drugs and heroin were always available to the guys, always part of the tour. And so, I think it resides with the manager to keep the artist kind of stable. How do you teach a young person who maybe hasn't been to school, has lived with their parents most of the time,
Sure,
is suddenly thrust into the spotlight? It's very hard to do. And John Bonham was one of those unfortunate guys. John was playing in bands from the time he was 15.
yeah, kid. He was a kid.
And by the time Led Zeppelin broke wide, John Bonham was 19.
It's unimaginable almost to know that kind of success and fame at such a young age, at any age, but especially at that age.
And he was a poor boy. He didn't have much money. His parents lived very frugally. They were very hardworking people. The next thing John knows is he's in Los Angeles with money and drugs and young girls and everybody who wants to take him to dinner, to show him this and that, sell him a car. John Bonham bought perhaps 25 cars by the time the third album came out.
My God.
Peter Grant never said to him, John, you got to protect some of your money.
Right.
He'd buy a car and he'd have it shipped back to the United States. The money was coming in fistfuls. I mean, when I say fistfuls, I mean literally. They did it in cash, and they traveled with cash.
Yeah.
And so the guys saw cash. Yeah. It was theirs for the asking. And, your head spins, and you do live in a bubble. And you're being told wherever you go how great you are, that reality just evaporates. And if you're lucky, and when I was with Bruce Springsteen, boy, was I lucky. There was a guy who kept his eyes right on the road, I don't know how Bruce knew how to handle himself, but it was innate. John didn't have that luck, John Bonham. And so by the time he's 32 years old, his life is gone.
That's it. To the question of that largeness, too much, too soon, too big.
Yeah.
There was some criticism leveled against the band for performing in large stadiums rather than smaller venues like clubs or bars, that they sought huge audiences. It's also been said that punk music was a response to the grandiosity and self-indulgence of stadium rock bands like Led Zeppelin. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, Led Zeppelin went from playing in small little places to playing in 20,000 seat arenas to 50,000 seat stadiums in a matter of a year and a half. And it kind of embellished what we talked about before of things getting away from them. Their audience got away from them. They used to really connect with that audience and feel the audience's energy. Take it from me, when you're playing in a stadium, you do not feel that audience's energy at all. It comes at you in kind of a wave, and it's not real, and it's not really people. It's just sound that you hear. And so you lose not just contact with your audience, but I think you lose contact with what you're playing and what it really means. And that's really hard for a band. And then, they play to 50,000. Sometimes there's chaos and they've got to run off. And then they wind up an hour later in a small one-bedroom hotel room with all this reverberation still affecting them and the adrenaline affecting them. And it gets nutty. I mean, it's a nutty life.
Sure. That's a great insight. You brought up Me Too at the top of the program, and we have to discuss it. Your book Your book does not shy away from examining some of the more morally complex and even notorious situations, their questionable behavior the band found themselves in. I guess it comes down to that age-old challenge of reconciling the artist and the person when the person does something categorically bad. Please talk to us about those and the way you decided to handle it. And can you also incorporate Laurie Maddox and her relationship with Paige and the cautionary tale of the groupie, especially underage like Laurie was, in the context of the Me Too movement, especially?
Yeah. Well, Laurie Maddox wasn't alone. I'll tell you that much.
Sure.
By the time Led Zeppelin got to LA, there were a lot of young women around. And when my wife made sure that when I wrote this book, that I would not call them young women. These were girls. They were 14 years old. And I will tell you, and I did not put this in the book, in many cases, they were 12 years old.
Oh, my God.
And Jimmy Page was 29. And these girls were sexually available to these guys. The band always said, hey, these girls threw themselves at us. But they didn't know what they were doing. They were young. They were 12 years old. I'm the father of a daughter. You know, my daughter was 12 years old at one point. I know what that looks like.
Sure.
I think it was up to the band and up to these guys to know that, you know, you got to behave in a certain way. And they didn't. There was a lot of bad behavior going on. It was like a Roman orgy. There were often 2, 3, 4 girls in a room with a guy at a time. Led Zeppelin exonerated bad behavior. I unfortunately paid for it because when my book was reviewed by all the major press, they didn't review the book. They reviewed the band's behavior. And I get it. I understand that. I felt that I had to approach it head on. I wasn't going to belabor it because I didn't want to write a book like had been written before about them, where it's just one sleazy episode after the next.
Sure.
I did try to separate the fact that, yes, they indulged in bad behavior, and yes, here is the music that they created and the life of a musician on the road. And so I think I gave you enough of an impression of what was going on without showing you all the dirty underwear. Now, you mentioned Laurie Maddox. Laurie was a 14-year-old girl, an LA girl who lived in the Valley, who had been involved at the age of 12 with David Bowie. Jimmy was shown a picture of her and said, I have to have this girl. Jimmy liked young girls. In fact, there's on my bulletin board, I'm just going to look at it. The Beastie Boys had a very famous song. If I played guitar, I'd be Jimmy Page. The girls I like are underage.
Oh, gosh.
And that is exactly what was going on at the time. You have to know it. If I'm going to tell their story, I've got to tell you. I spoke to Laurie Maddox. She's now a 60-year-old woman. I spoke to 5 or 6 other of the young women who were so-called groupies at the time.
Sure.
Do they feel regret? They still don't feel regret. You know, this was a major part of their lives. They wanted to be with rock and roll stars. Who's at fault here? I can tell you, the rock and rollers were at fault.
Sure.
You know, these girls were too young to know what they were doing.
Right.
But it was part of Led Zeppelin's legacy. It was the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and they lived it exponentially.
Again, I appreciate how sort of frank and direct you were in examining those aspects without ever sensationalizing it or indulging in the sleaziness, but you were very honest and critical of it. And as you said, it could have been perhaps why they decided to not participate in the research.
Most definitely. I was told by their lawyers These guys aren't talking. They don't want to dig a hole for themselves. I understood it, but
Mhm.
I mean, this is the price they have to pay. Sorry.
Sure, of course.
Yeah.
We're going to start taking questions for Bob shortly, so please start sending them in. While we wait for questions, I have a few left of my own, Bob.
Sure.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the fallout between Plant and Page? Some say it's been overstated. What have you discovered in your research?
Yeah, it's not overstated at all. I will tell you, a very good friend of mine had lunch with Robert a few weeks ago. Robert will not say the name Jimmy Page.
Wow.
Not come out of his mouth.
Wow.
It's like the way Joe Biden always says, "My predecessor."
Yeah.
Can't mention Trump's name. He will not say the words Jimmy Page. Robert has had it. I think it began in Oakland in 1979 with his son's death, with Robert's son's death, and all the craziness that happened thereafter. And it just grew and grew, even though they came together to make some music together later. Robert has divorced himself, and he will not talk about Led Zeppelin. He still plays a few of their songs in concert. Will never play Stairway to Heaven again.
Wow.
My wife, I'm sure, is happy to hear that. No love for each other. And I think if you recall seeing them on the Kennedy Center honors, Jimmy and Jonesy were delighted with what was going on stage. Robert did this. He looked away from the camera the whole time.
Wow.
And wouldn't look at the other two guys. It's all crashing down on them. Yeah.
It's telling. Yeah.
Really.
We have a question coming in, but I want to get two more of mine in before I start.
Sure, go ahead.
Do you know if any of the band members have read your biography yet, or their managers or agents? Have you heard any feedback yet from the Led Zeppelin camp?
I know that Robert's reading it right now. I know that Jimmy's read it. I haven't heard.
So they have it. They know it exists. They're reading it.
Right.
They've read it, but you don't know yet their opinion.
I don't. I have no idea. Thanks.
And we should say also that the Julia Child documentary by Betsy West was based on your biography of Julia Child.
My biography is called Deary. Yes.
Deary. Okay.
Yeah.
And then finally, one other note: your next project is a biography of the Rolling Stones.
I am the Rolling Stones biographer.
You're the Rolling Stones official biographer, and you, as of now, have access to the band.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Great. And that book should be done in about 4 years, thereabouts?
Did my editor put you up to that question?
Not at all.
Really? I mean, come on, give me a break. I'm one of the luckiest writers in the world. I have an editor who never tells me when my deadline is. He says, give me the book when you're done. And
that's great. That's great. For a
Right.
writer, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Okay, here's our question. There is a new book on hypnosis through the prism, Untold Rock Stories from the Hypnosis Archive by Audrey Powell. Can you talk a little bit about their work with Led Zeppelin? What is your favorite album cover by Led Zeppelin?
Well, I know nothing about that book. So I really can't address that. But I will tell you, the album cover, well, no way. Houses of the Holy. The album cover is amazing. And the story behind it is phenomenal. And I'm going to tell the people who are out there in the audience, read the book, because you'll never believe how that album cover came about and how it was produced. Those two young children were very young models at the time, and their parents allowed them to be naked and crawl up the stones of the causeway. Wow. In the worst weather, and in fact allowed them to be painted silver.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, with auto paint. It could never happen today.
Yeah.
But, and actually that young girl who was in that cover, Samantha, I can't remember her last name, but she is also on the back cover of Presents as an older person. And so I'll tell whoever asked me that, read the story in the book, because how that cover came about is really fantastic.
And the album itself marked a turning point in the band's trajectory as well, right? They wanted to change their image and increase audience capacity after their shows after that album.
And in addition to that, they decided that the album covers were going to be as important as the music. And they spent, you know, $20, $30, $40, $50,000 producing those album covers. Money was no object anymore. They wanted that to project their image so that you would be drawn into the album from the cover and then hear the music.
That's great. Really, really fascinating. Yeah, and there, once upon a time, an album cover could make or break a musician. I don't know if that emphasis is there anymore.
I don't know, but when I was a kid, if there was a great album cover and I had never heard the album and I was flipping through the bins, I might buy that album. You know, the covers were so unusual. When you saw, you know, Jethro Tull, oh my God, I mean, look at this band. I have to have that album, you know. People used to do that in those days and not so much anymore.
Yeah, it's kind of gotten lost, you know, people walking through stores. I have another question for you.
Sure.
Their last performance together, as you mentioned earlier, is December 10th, 2007 at the O2 Arena in London.
Yeah.
It was in honor of Ahmet Ertegun.
Ahmet Ertegun, right.
Ertegun.
He was the president and founder of Atlantic Records.
Atlantic Records. He had died in 2006, a year before the final reunion.
That's right.
Can you say just a little bit about that before we sign off?
Yeah. They decided they wanted to do it. First of all, they said they were never going to perform together again. The Live Aid concert that they did was a disaster. Jimmy was very upset having done it. Phil Collins was the drummer. He had never performed with them before. And Jimmy cut off Phil's mic in the middle of it just because he was so upset. You can see from Jimmy's face. So they weren't sure they were going to play the O2 concert. And then, you know, Robert, 10 minutes before the show said, I'm not going to sing Stairway to Heaven. Well, everybody was waiting to hear Stairway to Heaven. He and Jimmy really had an argument beforehand. Robert sang it, which Jimmy knew he would in the end. And they needed a drummer. They needed a real drummer who had some feeling for the music. And of course, they found it in Jason Bonham, John's son, who could mimic his father's sound, knew the music, knew the guys, could play with them. And I think it was a fitting tribute and a good send-off to Led Zeppelin at the end. I will shortstop your next question, and that is, they will never play together again.
I knew better than to even ask.
Right. Never. It'll never happen.
That's it. So we should tell our viewers that if you want to learn more about Bob and his work, or to request an autographed copy of his biography, you can visit his website at bobspitz.com to get more information.
Yeah.
Bob, this has been really enchanting. Thank you so much.
Brian, I've really enjoyed it, and I hope the audience has as well. Nice to meet you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Goodbye.
Take care.